The September-December 23 Examiners report has been released, as has the exam on the ACCA's practice platform. Now, I'm going to go through this document in this recording and draw out some really important key messages for you that are going to help with your exam preparation for AAA. And at the end, I'm also going to give you some advice on how best to use the September-December 23 exam as part of your exam preparation. I hope you find this recording useful. Now, the Examiner's report is an absolute goldmine of useful information that you can put to good use for your own exam preparation. Now, I have been through this document in detail, and I've actually built in a lot of these points I'm going to be bringing up with you into my course materials. So if you enjoy this video and you want to get my more formal support, then scan that QR code and send me a WhatsApp and you can join one of my courses. So I think there were three key points, big picture, big ticket items that come out of this examiner's report. The first of them, and the examiner said this a lot, students who passed wrote answers that had sufficient depth to explain each of their points fully. Students who wrote lots of points but didn't really explain them in detail, those students didn't tend to pass. Okay, so you're not trying to write as much as possible, cover as many things as you can. You're trying to pick out relevant points that answer the requirement, that use the scenario information so that you can write a fully developed point that will have sufficient content within it to score you a passing mark. Related to that breadth point, better students use the scenarios fully. The weaker students who didn't pass, those are the ones who wrote kind of generic bland answers that didn't really use the scenario. So my tip for you with AAA is start every point with something from the scenario. It's only worth getting into your answer if it uses something from the scenario. And even better than just having one fact from the scenario is try to build linkages between different facts. Try to have 2 or 3 facts in each of your points. And anything that you've learned, anything from the textbook, anything from a previous exam answer that you've memorized will not score, because your answer has to be tailored to the specific requirement. It has to be tailored to the specific scenario. So anything bland or generic that you feel like you're writing from your memory, that kind of thing is not going to score. And the examiner commented on it several times in this examiner's report that students who wrote pre-learned answers did not pass. Right, looking at question 1, and the comments specifically around question 1, the 50-mark case study question. And well, first thing to say is this looks like a standard requirement 1 to me, right? Risks, and then procedures, and then ethics. That's a standard question 1. Now, the examiner has published one of the standard ones that were used in September-December 23, but I know from my own students that sometimes the questions don't follow this exact format. So don't be surprised if in your exam it's not quite like this. Now, things I thought that were interesting out of here. Firstly is that materiality, well, you were told how to calculate materiality, and you were told to do it based on revenue. And so to score the marks for your materiality paragraph, which should be in your risks of material misstatement section, you had to do your 0.5 to 1% calculation, your materiality range, and then set your materiality level somewhere in that range and use facts from the scenario to justify whether it's a high or a low level of materiality. Personally, I always set it at the low level. Okay, so 0.5% of revenue. And then I find facts in the scenario to explain why it's a high-risk audit. And there will always be things in the scenario to suggest why it's high risk. And the examiner's comments, though, they stated that wherever you sat your materiality, you would get the mark. Anywhere in that range, as long as you justified it with facts from the scenario. Next thing is the verb that we see in the risk questions. And it always seems to be evaluate. And evaluate means you need depth to your answer. A business risk, fully evaluated, scores 2 marks. A ROM, fully evaluated, scores 3 marks. But a lot of students picked out relevant risks from the scenario, but didn't explain them in enough detail to score the 2 or 3 marks that were available. And the phrase that the examiner used is that better students explained how that risk arose using the scenario. And they explained why that risk was particularly significant. Again, using the scenario information. And to do that, you've got to use several facts from the scenario so that your answer has enough depth. So I think that's a really useful mindset in the risk question. Try and explain how the risk arose and why it's significant. Those two things will help to add depth to your answer. Next up, yes, this is always a requirement now in either the audit risk question or the risk of material misstatement or ROM question. You have to prioritise. You're told to do it. But the examiner commented that, again, very few students did this. And they missed out on an easy professional skills mark and technical marks as well for explaining their prioritisation. So what you have to do here is your biggest two ROMs, the ones that you think are the most significant, you have to say, this is my most significant risk of material misstatement, and explain why. And then the same for the second most significant, explaining why. And you can earn both technical marks for your explanations and a professional skills mark for judgment for doing it. And even better, because only the top students do this, the person marking your script will be impressed. And because it comes at the start of your answer, impressing the marker at the start of your answer means they're more likely to give you more credit later on. It's a really good idea to prioritise those top two risks. Now, in the procedures question, we're often seeing this at the minute in exam questions that are being published, that they ask you for the principal procedures, the main procedures, the big ones that focus on the highest risk areas. And here there were some judgmental matters around this store enhancement program. And so if your procedures focused on the judgmental matters, management judgment areas, you would score more credit and you'd score a professional skills mark as well. Don't write basic tests like cast the schedule or discuss with management, because those things are not principal procedures, right? And they won't score you marks and they'll cost you professional skills credit too. Now, the last question here, discuss ethical issues. A very common part D, a very common final part to the first question in the exam. But to score marks here, you had to discuss these issues in the context of the scenario. You couldn't just say, there's a self-interest threat, and then write a definition of a self-interest threat. You had to explain why a self-interest threat would arise in this particular situation, using the information in the scenario to make your point tailored. So in the ethics question, absolutely nothing rote learned. You have to tailor your answer using the specific facts in the scenario. Right, on to section B. And as always, there was one section B question which was on non-reporting, not about reporting, and a section B question that focused on reporting. So we start with question 2, which was the non-reporting question. And, well, look, the examiner has published yet another question that had quality management within it, but quite an unusual quality management question. This quality management question was about acceptance. So for you to answer the question here, you had to delve into the scenario and find things that would help you to discuss whether we'd be able to do a good job or not. Would we be able to deliver a quality audit? And because we should be considering that before we decide to take on the work. So your answers, for them to score heavily, they had to come back to how they were relevant to the quality of the work that the auditor would be performing. Next, A part 2 here, specific aspects of the terms of the engagement which should be agreed. The examiner is even using the word specific, which is saying, I'm not going to give you any credit for anything rote learned. You have to use the scenario. These points have to be relevant to this particular engagement, and they have to quote facts from the scenario to explain why they're relevant for you to score for them. Okay, and in the examiner's comments, they said that people who did that scored heavily. Anyone who just wrote basic generic terms like the fee or the timetable, they wouldn't score very many marks because those weren't specific enough to the scenario. Then in part A, the verb, I just wanted to touch on that briefly. The verb was evaluate and explain. And so for your answer to score fully, you had to have depth, right, to each of your points. And what I'd be looking at in this kind of question would be 2 sentences to explain each of the points in your answer. Otherwise, you're unlikely to have the depth that is required to score fully. Right, now genuinely on to part B, where you were asked for procedures to quantify a loss for the purposes of an insurance claim. And here you had to be confirming specific facts that you were told in the scenario and suggesting documentary evidence that would allow you to verify those facts. The examiner said a lot of students focused on the insurance policy, verifying details of what might be covered by the insurance policy and what might not be. But that wasn't what was asked for, and therefore didn't score marks. Okay, it had to be about finding things that would tell you how big the loss was, and there was plenty in the scenario to go at. Something that weaker students did, because they were trying to come up with 6 points, they could only think of 2 or 3, and so what they did is wrote some of them again, but reworded them slightly, because the marker might not realise it's the same point that you're writing again and again. You know that that's not going to score for you. So if you've only come up with 2 or 3 points and you can't think of any more, move on. There's no point repeating the same thing again. There's no point repeating the same source of evidence again, because you won't score for it twice. Move on and save the time and use it for somewhere else in the exam. Right, on to the reporting question. And unusually, well, it feels unusual because we're told that there's always a reporting question. But this reporting question had 16 marks on completion, that was part A, and only 4 marks on reporting. Now, this is something we're seeing increasingly often in the AAA exam, that actually the reporting part is a minor element of the question, and it's linked in with something else. So don't be surprised if this happens in your exam. Now, part A here, which was evaluating matters to discuss with management, again, you had to use the scenario. Of course you do, because you have to in every AAA question. But this one, I wanted to particularly highlight that in the scenario, there were lots of financial reporting issues. So to really be able to understand the issues, you had to be hot on your SBR knowledge. And that is something we're seeing in lots of AAA exam questions now. It's really important that before you sit AAA, you've already studied SBR. Ideally, you've passed it, but at least studied it so you are aware of all of the financial reporting standards. And it's important as part of your AAA preparation that you review those financial reporting standards and are comfortable with them, because they do get tested in AAA. And it would be very hard to pass this question if you didn't have sharp SBR knowledge. Now, in my course, I give you resources to recap SBR to make sure that you are covered. So if you're studying with me, you're in safe hands there. Now, something to highlight to you for this question, but also for many others, and the examiner often comments on this, right, that your actions have to be relevant to the particular phase of the audit. So here we're at reporting. We're at the end of the audit. And so we might be able to suggest gathering some extra evidence. But it's right at the end of the audit. We can't go back to the start again. So it's more about things like, what should we report to those charged with governance? What things do we need to do to make sure we can sign off this audit opinion? We may have to delay and therefore communicate that delay to those charged with management. It's actions that are relevant to the particular phase, right? And you will only score for actions if they are relevant, and you'll also get a professional skills mark if you follow that instruction. If you ignore it and you say things like, make sure that we train the audit team for next year's audit, you will lose a professional skills mark, because that's not relevant to helping us to issue this particular audit report. Right, on to the actual reporting part, where we were asked to justify an appropriate audit opinion. Now, to do that, you needed to discuss and conclude. The discussion needed to talk about what type of issue it is. Is it a misstatement? Is it a lack of sufficient appropriate audit evidence? And discuss that using things in the scenario. And you had to discuss how big the issue is. Is it material? Is it material and pervasive? And use information from the scenario to help you to make that assessment before concluding on what the appropriate audit opinion should be. Now, you were told specifically to explain the aggregate impact, right? And aggregate means combined. Bring those two misstatements together. And, well, the examiner wanted to make sure everyone really knew what that meant. It means don't do each of them individually. Can you guess what a lot of students actually did? Of course! They completely ignored that and they discussed each of the misstatements individually because that was their process. That's what they normally do. You've got to answer the question that is put in front of you. Okay? Not the question that you're expecting. Not the question that you practiced as part of your exam preparation with your training provider. You have to answer the specific question that you are asked in the exam. Really important. Right, a little bit of advice now on the September-December 23 exam. This exam is precious. Okay, it is the examiner's latest style. Shows you the topics that they're testing and the way they expect you to answer them. Okay, do not waste it by sitting this exam too early. Okay, I want you to sit it when you are ready. So make sure that you've done your AAA exam preparation. You've done your revision. You've practiced lots of past exam questions, perhaps from the ACCA Study Hub. Perhaps you've used lots of the resources that I provide for you on my YouTube channel and on my podcast. And then when you're ready, towards the end of your exam preparation, use this as a final mock. That's how I use it on my course. After the students have done my final mock, which is questions that I've written, with the ones they've not seen anywhere else, I give them the December 23 exam to do as part of their preparation in the final week of the exam, and I include my answers and debrief resources so that you can get as much value as possible out of it. So if you are going to join my course, you will be using this exam as part of your preparation. I hope you found this video useful and best of luck with your AAA exam prep.